Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Data on Kubernetes community. We've done over 30 meetups now at this point. My name is Bart Farrell, and as always, it's a pleasure to be hosting you here today on Tuesday afternoon where I am, Tuesday morning, I believe, where you are, Ben. And today we have, as always, but today we really do have a very special guest in many ways, someone who's blazing his own trail, who's created his own path. And you can find out a lot more about him on his blog. We'll definitely be linking that. You can find it on our LinkedIn. You can find it as well. It's pretty easy to find. Don't think there's a lot of competition in SEO for Seattle data guys. So that was a very good choice. Just for folks that might be new joining, you can see the links on the screen to our Twitter, to our Slack, and to our LinkedIn. We're there. You can get in touch with us. Like I said, my name is Bart. We're always looking for speakers. Doesn't matter what your level is. If you're approaching this data world, this Kubernetes world, we're always looking for people with different ideas, people from different countries. We're doing meetups in Portuguese. We're doing meetups in Spanish. We're doing meetups in Dutch. Hopefully going to be doing meetups in Russian. So like I said, you speak any language, you have ideas you want to share, you can get in touch with us. As I said, today, our guest is Ben Rogojan, who is also known as the Seattle data guy. And obviously that name comes for a reason. There's a reason why it's not the Chicago data guy, or hopefully no one's out there copying you, patent pending. And you've worn many hats, but now you're very concentrated, I believe, on consulting. We're interested in hearing more about that. And today we're going to be hearing about the full data lifecycle and where do we go from here. So without further ado, Ben, if you could just introduce yourself, explain a little bit about how you got to this position, straddling both kind of worlds of both data science and data engineering, and what you're up to now.
Yeah, sure. Just as like so I guess a quick background on me. I originally kind of started in the healthcare kind of analytics space, probably because honestly, when I first started, we talked about this, or you brought this up earlier, is like in college, I was introduced to the concept of epidemiology, and that was kind of like the first concepts of like data visualization, using data kind of in a more applicable way outside of kind of more of just your typical statistics course and in real life ways. That I found very interesting, and so when I came into the workforce I really wanted to work kind of just to see what's occurring in like the healthcare space, what kind of analytics is going on there. So that's really where I think I did a lot of work as far as healthcare goes and analytics goes. So that's kind of where it all started. Since then I've worked for a few other companies, some big tech, as well as, again, like you brought up, starting my own consulting company. It started honestly when I only about 2 years in, because I had a friend who asked me to do some help just to develop some database products and a dashboard. And from there, it's kind of stemmed off into me working into a couple different industries, everything from like insurance, transportation, SaaS, and doing everything from, again, starting from complete scratch, where I'm working with a lot of companies that maybe have never really had a data strategy or never really used data to do anything whatsoever as far as like analytics goes, besides maybe some basic reporting, and really taking them to like that next level. Maybe they need a data warehouse, maybe they need a model, and really just taking them from that raw state to that end state. And so I've really had that, like you said, like you kind of brought up, that ability to kind of straddle both data engineering and data science. I do think I tend to be more on the data engineering side. I think a lot of the work still needs to be done in the data engineering side in general. So that's why I think, there's just a lot of work there. A lot of my clients, that's where it starts. I think data science just has all the fun stuff to do. You got to build that base layer.
Isn't it kind of it that maybe it's like the two sides of the same coin, but it does seem that just in general, in terms of profiles that we encounter nowadays, somebody might study mathematics or physics or biotech, might drift into the data science world. Whereas data engineering, what would you say, just in basic terms of how, because there might be some confusion from some of your clients about what might be involved in each one of those profiles, and saying, well, this is more of a data science task, this is more of a data engineering task. For folks that want to get more into data engineering, what kind of resources might you recommend, or good starting points?
Yeah. So I think there's like a few key areas that data engineering deals with. You've got one, it's just kind of the data movement aspects, so taking data from raw to some sort of final or production layer of data. This is often like either an ETL, ELT, streaming data. There's a couple different kind of sources there. So you can look into things like, Airflow or ETLs versus ELTs if you're trying to kind of figure out the difference, and then streaming tools as well, like Kafka or Kinesis, just to kind of understand these various components and what they're supposed to do. And then you can kind of find the tools underneath them, because I think you kind of have to understand what you're trying to do, and then you can kind of figure out, okay, I want to use Airflow or whatever it might be. So that's one side of it. The other side is definitely more of like the data modeling side, which I think is ever changing in terms of like we've kind of gone away from, or not gone, we're kind of like evolving from what used to be a little more like Kimball style data warehouses and like and Inman style data warehouses, and moving away from that just because we can now like store data almost more however we want. So I think we're trying to figure out what that means in a lot of cases. So I think it's evolving, but I think there's a lot of value if you want to go learn about like Kimball and Inman and kind of the original styles. You know, they both, I think, have books. And a lot of those are still pretty much used pretty readily almost everywhere I've been today. Again, I just think a lot of companies are challenging a lot of those models because, you know, they're still kind of slow to develop, and a lot of people are trying to get that data so fast. Yeah, that's kind of a challenge. So yeah, ETLs, data warehouses, two key places to kind of learn. And then just general, you know, programming. You're always going to, not always, but I think, you know, understanding programming is pretty key in, you know, as a data engineer. So I think most people, you know, as long as you know like Python or Java or Scala or something that's like very applicable, I think those are usually beneficial. And then SQL is definitely the bread and butter. Like oftentimes what you'll find is the coding you do is often more of just like a framework to go around the SQL or whatever you're writing, you know, to actually do the data movement. And so I think those are kind of the key areas that you'll see, you know, you want to learn is if you want to be a data engineer. And it's all about, you know, really kind of creating that central data repository that you can access all of these different sources from, right? Because that's generally the challenge you see is like, you know, I'm finding even companies, again, in like the $10-20 million range will have like 7 different data sources. You know, they've got their commerce platform, they've got their CRM, they've got Salesforce, they've got, you know, all these different places. So just being able to bring it all together. So that's generally what I try to explain to people. It's like, well, it's just going to be easier, right? Otherwise, you've got to, you know, pull an Excel report from Salesforce and then this report from here and this report from here, and then kind of glue them all together every time you need to do this analysis. So, you know, how do we avoid that? So.
And that's interesting too, also because it's something that's recurring in a lot of our conversations with different folks out there is we've got one thing with the technological aspect, but then there's also a thing of a cultural aspect. And so what you're saying is like, let's create a culture where there's unification amongst tools and we're not having, you know, kind of islands or silos where things are operating in different ways, and that makes it much harder than to probably get all that data together and analyze it. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's always the fight. I think that's like, you know, it's been the concept of data warehousing for, I don't even know how long, probably the last 30, 40 years. It's a constant fight. Like, I think it's one of those things where it's like, you maybe centralize some new system, and then by the time you finish, you know, with Salesforce, then they get it, like you have 10 new tools that the company has purchased that you're now like, oh, now we have to figure out how to add these in. Or maybe they're switching over from Salesforce to something else. So I think it's one of the hard things. Like the pieces are always moving. And so I think that's the big fight that we're constantly in, and why companies are continually needing to do data engineering work. It's just because it's like, there's just so many moving pieces and so much changing. Also just data is getting bigger in the sense that, you know, we went from just being able to look at like CRM data and ERP data, which was kind of, you know, like you think about like the base level, like that used to be kind of the main way you looked at it. It wasn't very complex. And now you're going to e-commerce, you're going to IoT, and you're just getting so much more data. And so even once we manage like the base level of ERPs and base levels of data, then you have all this other layers that you're going to have to deal with again, like IoT and crazy amounts of data that can literally tell you what someone's doing step by step versus just kind of their clicks online. So yeah, it's just constantly growing for what we need to kind of manage.
Yeah, good. That being said, you know, the topic for today is data lifecycle. Can you just explain roughly what that means before getting more into it?
Yeah, sure. So to me, it just means, you know, the process of going from essentially something raw data to some sort of end product. So it's very similar to me. So like, you know, when you think about the software lifecycle, where it's like you start with some sort, you want to do something, and how do you go from like, you know, an idea to like that final product? And here it's like you're still kind of developing software in the data product lifecycle. Often it's like a dashboard or a machine learning model, something like that. And then from there, you know, it needs to be put into production, needs to be monitored, needs to be, you know, QA. You often want to add new features. You often want to, you know, maybe you want to add a new chart to a dashboard. Maybe you want to add a new KPI and all these things, and trying to manage that whole flow in a method that is a little more maintainable and a little more sustained, and not just kind of, you know, kind of out there.
All right. So when we're talking about raw sources, you mentioned some of these earlier about, you know, it could be insurance, it could be healthcare, it could be IoT. What are some of the new sources that you seem to be coming in?
I mean, again, I think a lot of companies, not necessarily new, but like, a lot of companies that are much smaller, again, like the 10 to $20 million range that you're running into a lot, are just bringing in their e-commerce data and trying to analyze it for the first time and trying to just gather it, understand it, trying to figure out how to better, manage everything. They're trying to optimize their own businesses the same way like large companies are. So I think there's that aspect of it where it's like some companies are just getting started on this whole data journey. I think that it's less about like maybe new data sources. I think, a lot of companies are still kind of dealing with their current, and it's more about like better integration that I think is where a lot of companies are trying to spend a lot of their time, which is, like, how do we make sure that we can connect our data from Workday to Salesforce to Zendesk, in one proper flow, and not, have all this disparate data sources that, yes, we put them all in data warehouse, but we can't even join them. So I think there's a lot more work being done there at that base layer than like trying to bring in new data. I think there's tons of IoT data obviously being brought in. If you're a manufacturing plant, I think you're definitely seeing that. But I think, still for a lot of companies, they're still just trying to like, again, connect everything together so they can actually get the insights they're trying to work on.
Mm-hmm. So when you're approaching companies, as a consultant, do you find that you have a sort of standard set of, questions that you might be asking or metrics that you want to look at, or is it more done on a case-by-case basis?
I mean, there's definitely like, I think it starts with kind of your standard set of questions that then, rolls into more of a case-by-case basis, right? Like, I'll kind of try to figure out what data sources they have, if they have any plans or have already kind of done some work as far as, data engineering, trying to centralize their systems more, what tools they were using, I try to understand kind of their team's kind of data understanding and like, am I building something where, it's going to be data warehouse and your team's going to build dashboards on top of it? Or am I building something so I can, build dashboards on it because, your team maybe doesn't have the technical skill to do it or time to do it. So I think those are generally what I try to assess first is, just where are you at? What data sources do you have? Have you done any work at all? Or is this kind of, starting out, and then trying to figure out your business goals? I think that's the other big area. It's like, okay, what do you even want to do? What is your hope at the end of this? Do you have questions that you want to answer? Or do you have no idea and you're just trying to, you assume there's value, and trying to assess where they are? Because again, some people have very specific ideas. Some people have tons of ideas and they've read tons of articles and they might all be good, but you have to kind of pick what actually aligns with the business, and what actually is going to fit, in a certain time frame. So I think those are the key areas, like where are you at and what are you actually wanting to do? Are kind of the standard sets of questions I will try to put out there.
Yeah, it doesn't seem difficult sometimes that maybe when you talk about objectives or, what are your goals, that the client might assume that, no, that's your job. That's why I'm hiring you. And so sometimes to do that work might take some encouragement.
Yeah. So that's definitely sometimes an aspect. I don't think I've had anyone say that like directly, but I've definitely had, that kind of component where it's like they don't know. It's just like we have all this data, we assume that there's value, and I think some of that comes with talking to them, like trying to like figure out where they actually want to, use that data. You can often talk to them and they have questions. They just, maybe have not crystallized them or put them down. And so just trying to lead them to those questions to find them. And then also, that gives you the opportunity to kind of explore their data too, because there will likely be some value, especially if they've never looked at their data before. It's funny how little some people have in as far as insights go into their data. Like I've talked to people who don't even know who their top 10 customers are. Like I don't like, they have to like pull out that report and I'm like, that's like, so, and that's happened more than once where it's like, so it's one of those things where it's like, even doing those base level things sometimes can help someone just get a better understanding. It's about kind of just, sorry, now I'm forgetting kind of where the question was going.
No. But it's basically the question about objectives is that I think whether it's any sort of question is that a lot of times it's like, okay, like you said, they may have data, but they don't know what to do with it, but they assume there's value in it. With that in mind, I remember about 5 years ago, my boss went to I think it was a Hadoop conference, I think. I'm not sure, but a lot of big data technologies around, and came back with all these stickers and t-shirts saying data is the new bacon. Obviously we can enter into dietary discussions and things about being vegan or not, or whether or not we want to go plant-based or not. And we'll later talk about food because you also have a food background. But do you agree with that statement? Or they'll say data is the new oil, it's the new this, it's the new that. Is it really about having it or what you decide to do with it?
I mean, it's definitely like what you decide to do with it. And that's like, so obviously I've seen plenty of articles where it's like, first, and I think this is like always the trend with articles. As someone, I'll talk about this later. I write a lot. You see this with article writing. First people are like all for this concept, right? Oh, data's the new oil, and like everyone's writing articles about it, and then people get sick of it, and then people start writing counter articles, right? Like, stop saying data's the new oil. And it's like, okay, guys, like we get it. You want to be contrarian. I think to some aspect, like I understand the analogy of oil, right? Because oil has so many uses, but it requires things like refining, requires steps like, actually getting it to the point of, being usable. So that's why, like, I don't necessarily like, I get like why people might hate it, but like, I also understand why you would use that analogy. There's a lot of truth to it where it's like data has a lot of applications. It doesn't just have, machine learning applications. You can, again, also create dashboards and KPIs, and there's all this value, but it also requires a lot of processing and using, and actually, really like prefabricating essentially. It can't just be used right away. It's often very dirty. And then also like, as far as like, as almost like value in itself, just being there is like, if that data is cleaned, there's a lot of value in it. There's a lot of companies that make a ton of money just by often providing more of that, not being the commodity, but being like the car, right? Like they're, and I'll talk about this, in the talk, there are companies that they're 100% of their revenue is basically their data product, right? Like they sell a dashboard or they sell something that they've just pre-made, and then you give them the data. You basically just pay them for the insight. So I think that's why I sometimes kind of do agree with that analogy. Again, I can see why people might hate it because it's been used so much, but it's one of those things where it's like, okay, but the point of an analogy is just to simplify a concept. So
right,
you might hate it, but
at the end of the day, it's like, hey, we got it into 5 words, so let's just be happy that we were able to synthesize the concept. Now, with these questions, I think we have good groundwork. If you want to jump into the points you want to go over related to data lifecycle, go for it.
Yeah. So do you mind if I share my screen?
Absolutely, go for it. Yeah.
I'm going to share, and then present.
Oh, we already have a question. So
I saw that.
First of all, thanks. Do you want to take that now, or do you want to take it later?
I maybe take it later if no.
That's okay. Yeah,
Perfect.
Keep the questions coming in the chat, but we're gonna say we'll get through the presentation first, and then we'll get into the questions. And if for whatever reason we don't get into the questions today, we can definitely consider continue the conversation in Slack, on Twitter, etc. So no problems there. Go for it.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, just kind of to round up the talk. The goal of this talk is kind of discuss about like the data product lifecycle, as well as some of the challenges that we face. Also, you can all see my screen, right? I don't know if I asked that.
Yeah, we're all good. Yep.
Perfect. All right. So kind of what's on the agenda for today, I kind of want to talk about some of the experiences I've had in the world of data, both, kind of like where I started and kind of things I was learning, what problems you run into, when you're building data products, kind of what is a data product? What am I defining as a data product? What is a data product lifecycle? What are kind of the problems you run into when you're even with a data product lifecycle? Like where are the gaps? How are we trying to solve those, and kind of what tools are at our disposal? So that's kind of my goal for today. Again, kind of just, we started this earlier, but a quick background about me. Again, I started in healthcare analytics, and then I've consulted pretty widely at this point for a multitude of industries, including, things like finance, insurance, transportation. I think that's given me a lot of insight just because, again, all these different industries often have a lot of similar problems. You often have to start with trying to figure out what data they have. You often have to start with, often getting them out of whatever mindset they might have been in before, like, especially if you're working with bigger companies where they have kind of patchworked data infrastructure where it's, all run on cron or something where it's not very concise. And also I've had a lot of experiences as far as like coming in at different stages. I've come in stages where, they have nothing, they've got no data product whatsoever, or no work ever done. They just have these databases or applications, and they'd like to centralize a lot of information. And I've also come into places where, maybe they've already tried to do some work with another consultant, and that consultants or teams maybe had struggled to, bring that product to fruition. So I've come in and kind of, finished off some products in a couple of cases, as well as kind of replacing old products and migrating services. So I've also come in where people already had an idea of what they wanted. They just need to migrate for one reason or the other. And so all these kind of things have different challenges as far as, developing products or even, just fitting in different pieces in as far as the data product lifecycle goes. So I've had that opportunity to really play the whole kind of field as far as from raw data to kind of either some sort of ML model or dashboard. And so I always kind of like the insights I've gotten from all those different steps. On top of that, I like to say I'm an accidental writer, just because at this point I have, like I think most tech people have started, you started a Medium at some point, and that blew up into, one, it helps me get clients. Two, I at this point also write for a couple other companies as well on technical topics. So, you can find me under Seattle Data Guy, but you can also probably find me under a few other companies that I've written for in the past. So it's definitely a lot of fun.
Quick question on that. I mean, you obviously have to organize yourself very well for consulting, for speaking, for writing. Just for folks out there that might be interested in generating their own content, what's your secret to that, or how do you do it?
I mean, I think there's a couple things. Like, one, you have to kind of choose what you want to do. In a sense of like, you have to prioritize what needs to get done first. Like there are definitely things like for this talk, like I've had to put off a few writing things because it's like, well, I have to choose what to finish. So sometimes you just have to make sure you finish something. I think that was something I learned from someone else that was very smart. It's better to just finish something and not have like 10 or 20 projects opened and half done.
Like the story of my life.
Right. Yeah. It's like constantly trying to actually close boxes. That's what I like to tell people. I'm like constantly opening boxes and constantly closing them again. So I think that's one aspect of it. I think another aspect is, constantly try to, you're constantly doing things in your day-to-day that you can write about, in terms of like, I consulted about something, and while it's fresh in your mind, it's not a bad idea to write about it. Or vice versa, maybe you're writing about something and it makes it very easy to now talk about consulting about it. So I think that's another aspect is, you don't have to constantly do new things. I think people are constantly trying to be super innovative and new. And it's like, there's a lot of basic concepts that you can cover as far as writing goes that you're dealing with. Like, there's often problems that you're dealing with as a consultant that maybe you feel are unique, that probably aren't. And so it's probably worth writing about. And so I think that's something that's a good concept to understand, is like, if you're experiencing a problem, someone else is probably experiencing it too. So it's probably worth writing about. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I do it. I'm constantly trying to just balance. Yes, I'm constantly trying to balance it, but like oftentimes I try to overlap as much as I can.
Mm-hmm.
So that way I'm, getting the synergy as much as possible. So you can find me Seattle Data Guy on Medium, but also I've the SeattleDataGuy.com and Substack, and every content developer creators like kind of platforms at this point. And then you brought it up earlier. I also did do a lot of food work at some point in my life. I was in fine dining to basically pay my way through college. There was a part of me that thought that's what I was going to do with my life until I went from 16 to 20 and realized how much of a raise I got between those like 4 or 5 years, and decided that probably wouldn't be for me. But it was a lot of fun. I did a lot of different works. Everyone's baking bread now, and I was like, oh, I was doing that like every day for work before. But that was a past life at this point. It's I think at this point like almost a decade behind me, and so it feels so long ago. All right, so that's a quick background about me, kind of my data experience. It's been a lot of fun, definitely from the perspective of different problems I got to solve.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So when I first started working in data, I wanted to kind of just cover some things about like just often dumb things I was doing because, no one told me better. The first place I ever worked was at a hospital, and I had that lucky fortune to where, the person that had hired me and was a little more technical ended up leaving like a week after I started. And they never hired a more technical person. And so I ended up falling into that technical role. And then, just figuring out all the ways you can make terrible decisions as far as, doing analysis and creating data products. So for example, like just saving queries in Excel. So I think that was something I eventually picked up from another friend, where they were like, oh, I would do this analysis or this thing and just save the query in Excel. And then now you've got that query saved and it's attached to that Excel document. So you know which query went to what Excel document. So I think that was something that I was just like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And that becomes very hairy very quickly. You're constantly like, wait, did I make changes to this query? I don't remember. When I ran it, which one did I run? Did I remember to copy and paste the new query into this, Excel document? So I think that was definitely one of those things that was painful, and it will make your your data process, whatever it might be, very unmaintainable, because once you leave teams or companies, now does someone know about that document? Does someone know they've got to run this query? So you just run into a lot of problems like that. Kind of lack of data management, and I mean that in a couple of different ways. One is just like I think I picked up this habit again from like looking at other people's examples where it was just like, oh, you can just kind of have like some data be in an Excel and some data be in a table and some data be, on a Google sheet somewhere, and you can just join it all together.
On a napkin, yeah.
Yeah, you can join it all together on Tableau and it'll be great. And, again, that just goes back to it's not a sustainable process. Often, again, like you might have to update that Excel so often and you think, it's fine, but it just quickly becomes, a mess. So that's definitely something I remember. Version control. And I think the thing I find funniest about this example, obviously this is like docs and whatever, but the fact that I think this joke is so poignant to so many people tells me that a lot of people have done this, where it's just like, it's like, like final version, like whatever,
corrected by so-and-so, number 35,000.
You put the date time stamp on it, you're like, that'll make it clear. Oh wait, now I've had two different versions on the same date. Okay, well, this is the final version. No, this is finally the final version. And so like version control problems where, again, everything from queries to data sets to, maybe some sort of Jupyter notebook, whatever it might have been, there's just this lack of kind of tracking that I would do because, it just would make sense, right? Like you're just trying to do work, you're just trying to go forward. And I think also when you're just starting out in the tech field, especially, you're not used to the pace. Often I think in school, you're very used to like, oh, I built a website in a week, and then suddenly you're going into a company and it's like, it took me 2 weeks to change a data field, because there's a lot more process often involved or something. So I think that's also an aspect we run into, is like, we're trying to move so fast because that's what we're used to. But oftentimes that leads to, again, unmaintainable practices, like, again, just saving file names with a little suffix or prefix that's supposed to define what something is. So that's I think another major problem that I realized very quickly, and then no performance tracking for models. So I think another aspect that I've seen a little less, and I don't think I had to do as much model deployment where I had this problem, maybe because I at this point started getting a little bit better, but it's definitely a problem, which is you deploy, we start deploying models, and there's this, we kind of forget this step where it's like, well, how is that model actually doing? We've put out this thing. Is it, giving us the right output? Are the people responding to it, or whatever that model is supposed to do? Is it actually benefiting us the way that we're hoping that it's supposed to benefit us? If it's supposed to, optimize pricing, you probably want to do something like track your sales or something to see if you're actually increasing pricing, or increasing closing rate of sales, or whatever it is that you're trying to do. But having that definition of goal, I think is something that you start realizing as you go on with ML models, but I think you kind of get skipped over. Again, we're so focused, I think, as data people and as engineers, at just making something work. We don't always necessarily think about the maintainable aspect and the aspect of, okay, beyond just how does it work, how's it going to live in the whole tool? And so this is kind of when I first started working, just some of the problems I was definitely running into and learning from. So basically, kind of what these lead to and what problems I've seen these lead to as far as data product development goes, lack of coherent data process, without kind of having some sort of process. And I mean, that could be almost any step of the whole way. It could be as far as developing the SQL that's going to go into a dashboard that's now used to make $1 million decisions. The lack of having some sort of process in there, can pretty easily lead to, bad SQL, bad logic. I think SQL is much trickier than most people realize, or at least it's not so much about the SQL being tricky. It's probably more about, the data model being tricky or things like that. As well as often, if you don't have kind of a coherent data process, it can also lead to kind of systems that are very just patchworky. I brought up cron earlier, but I think there's a lot of openings for that, where you're just like, oh, I'll just run this Python script at 12 a.m. in the morning, and then it'll call something else, or maybe I'll just set another script later on. I don't really plan to have any dependency tracking. It's just going to kind of run later, and they should not run into each other, and there'll be no problems. And so I think that kind of happens when you don't have coherent data processes and clear kind of methods for deploying code. So I think that's a big issue I've definitely seen, where every team kind of just takes on their own method for ETLs or whatever it might be. It's like, again, one team might use SSAS, one team might use Airflow, one team might just use Python scripts. And that, again, that just often leads to very difficult systems to maintain and other kind of challenges. Another kind of challenge that I've seen is poor model performance tracking. So again, just deploying models and then not really thinking about the KPI standpoint and what it will do once it gets out there. That's where you can have, one, you risk, someone arguably taking advantage of that model for their own gain, or just to do something silly, like, regardless how you feel about it. But, I think, right, like if I recall, Reddit did the whole thing where they had Trump show up when you Googled the word, I think, like idiot or something, which was just basically through a combination of like SEO and Google's model, which is, it's funny. But like, there's definitely some bad ways I can assume models can be used in the same way, like where it's a little more nefarious than just, a joke. So I think
recognizing the intent behind the search and then guiding, obviously, to a certain destination, anticipating what the person's going to be looking for. And we can definitely see and have seen the use or misuse of those sort of techniques, right?
Yeah, so I think that can also sometimes play in that model performance. Like, is the model actually still doing the thing that you meant it to do, or is it is it acting weird? Is the data changing? Is the input changing? Is the output changing? Kind of just constantly tracking that. And then I kind of brought this up already, but yeah, NoSQL or dashboard QA. So SQL is one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it is definitely like dashboards. So when you have things like Tableau, I often like to say, like, try to put as much logic as you can in one layer. Like if you're going to do a lot of logic, try to do it in SQL or try to do it in dashboard, but pick, because, basically I would say you have to QA both at the end of the day. Because if you start adding, calculated fields or something like that into your Tableau or Chart.io or whatever tool you might be using, you're just adding more like risk of some new error happening, right? And so if you don't have any QA at those steps, that's what you're likely going to have. You're going to have some bad data that you weren't expecting, and especially with like Tableau. And this is kind of why I prefer doing it in SQL. Tableau, I think, is harder to look at all the data and every possible filter and every possible thing that you've set up. So it's very hard to integrate test, except for manually going through and checking each filter. But even if you at least do that, I think that's a benefit, going through and making sure that if you spot check your dashboard, it's giving you the output that you expect. So having those kind of layers where you think beyond just writing the SQL, and it's like, okay, the SQL is right, or maybe you QA the SQL, but you don't see QA all the work that you then put on in your dashboard, I think just leads to risks and possible bad decisions being made. Okay, as far as what data products are, and before I go too much farther, I just want to kind of talk about what I mean when I refer to data products. I'm sure that there could be more examples of this, but this is generally what I've built as far as data products go. So this could be like a dashboard, so Tableau, Chart.io, Power BI, etc. Reports. So this could just be, honestly, like sometimes you just need a list. Like sometimes some companies just are looking for risks or looking for a list of maybe customers they need to contact, or maybe they're trying to do some sort of thing in fraud work, and they need people to go look at some claims in healthcare, and they just need a list of all the claims they need to look up. So this is not necessarily a dashboard. It's just often just like some sort of report that's again in Excel that they can look at. So that's kind of another product. Machine learning models, again, I think that kind of goes pretty self-explanatory. You're just trying to, whatever that might be, pretty broad. Again, like people might argue about the various types, AI, deep learning, et cetera, but I'm just kind of gathering it all into one and putting it into one section here. So that's kind of another data product, because it requires, again, some development. It requires data. It requires all these different steps to go from, just raw data to some more refined product. And then data APIs. This can be, just something where you're creating a tool that allows it to very easily extract that data. Like maybe someone needs to pull data for their company, whether it's just that raw API, like if you're trying to pull data from Asana or something like that, I kind of consider those a product in themselves as well. Because you do often need to create some sort of system that, ensures your data is still performant, you're not taking too long to pull that data, and, you're pulling only the right data when you ask. And so those are kind of what I mean when I say data product, just so that we have a baseline of what I'm referring to. All right. All right, so I did want to talk about the fact that, as far as data products go, and why I like to talk about it is because I think a lot of companies build what I consider data products internally, but they're often not their main focus. And so I think that often leads to problems that I'll talk about shortly. But there are a lot of companies that data products are literally maybe nearly 100% of their revenue, or a big portion of their revenue. So if you look at like Health Catalyst, they really create a ton of pre-made dashboards and reporting and models for healthcare data, basically. So they basically just built all these dashboards and then have to sell them to other companies, and then those companies have to keep paying for them. And the value or the problem there is obviously if you just build a dashboard that is unreliable, doesn't report your data correctly, you're likely to obviously lose customers. So they're very much forced to build dashboards that people want to use and want to use over and over again. I can say something about their design, it's okay, but besides that, again, they're actually a pretty successful. I think I don't remember if they're still in startup phase, but I know they've had a decent amount of funding as far as what they're trying to do. And then beyond pricing is more of an ML or data science type model where they dynamically price your Airbnb rentals for you. Again, they basically prepackaged a ML model for companies or for people to use so that they can just plug and play very easily. And obviously that means that whatever they're producing needs to act in the best way possible so people keep using this tool. You can't just build this and then not track the output and track how it's doing, because it could go haywire, because that's just what software does, and then lead you to losing business. And so I think these are two examples of products and companies that are having to force themselves to really think about that data product lifecycle at a different level again. And I think just to keep going with this kind of thought, and why I kind of put that first and then this next is those are examples of, I think, companies that do this probably daily. It's part of their their lifeblood. And I think what I often see when you go into like corporations is there's this kind of gap there where it's like whenever you go to a big company, you kind of run into the same issues, which is I like to call one thing the dashboard graveyard. So again, where you see Health Catalyst, they've got this dashboard that they're selling and they have to keep selling every month or whatever their subscription is. Often I find that a lot of companies will have thousands of dashboards, many of which aren't even used, right? Like, so that's why I kind of refer to it as a dashboard graveyard. You've got all this time being spent on building dashboards that then get pretty quickly dropped or just don't get used after the first few days of being deployed. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. Maybe it was just a lack of business alignment, which is kind of the example at the end. But also, maybe it's the UI, maybe it's just maybe the dashboard didn't really actually answer the questions that you were trying to answer. Maybe it doesn't drive anything at all. Maybe it's just a bunch of what we call vanity metrics. So vanity, for those who don't know, vanity metrics are often just like KPIs that maybe don't provide any sort of actionable insights. It might just be some numbers that you can kind of point at when things are going well and be like, oh, look how good we're doing, and ignore when things are going bad, because it's not really attached to anything anyways, right? So if you can't really act on it, there's not a lot of point looking at it. And so that's why I see a lot of things happening is, you just get stuck, deploying this dashboard that never works. So I think that's kind of an interesting problem that you run into.
And with that in mind, sorry, also regarding like we can say the cultural coaching, explaining that while some metrics might look really sexy or really nice to be able to put out there, let's say to investors or for different kinds of things, to be able to, once again, say to sort of correct or guide your clients in understanding what kind of metrics they really need. How do you go about doing that? Obviously with a lot of patience and being friendly, I imagine. How do you do that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing is like, I try to figure out what they're actually going to do with the metrics that we're developing, right? Like, I'm like, okay, well, if this number goes up, what does that mean to you? And how would you change your actions, right? Like, what are you actually going to do if you see that, your average sales your average sales price is going down, right? Like if you're selling some sort of service that has some, it's maybe a little more variable in costs, and it's like, well, what would you do if your sales price is going down? What would be your next question? And that kind of also goes into the whole process of developing a dashboard in itself, because it's like oftentimes you're developing this kind of high level KPI, and then from there you want to ask, okay, well, what questions, if you saw this number go up, what questions would you have to basically lead you to the action that you need to take? If your sales average sales price is going down, you'd probably ask something like, is it caused by the salesperson? Is it caused by the time of year? Is it caused by all these different things? And that way you can kind of figure out what your action is. Is it no action because, it's just the time of year, or is there action because, your salesperson, there's some salesperson that's suddenly doing way worse, but everyone else is doing fine. And then you can kind of then go act on that knowledge. So I think that's an aspect of it, is like trying to figure out what they're actually going to do with it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's the biggest thing, is just trying to figure out what it actually ties to them in real life. I think another aspect of it is also trying to make sure KPIs are simple enough that you can do that. I think sometimes it's tempting to make a KPI that's very complex, like it's some sort of ranking number, right? And that ranking number might be based off of like 20 different whatever things that you're surveying or querying, but if that's the case, and then how are you supposed to know what that even means, right? Like when you see like, oh, we're in the 98th percentile or we're in the 20th percentile, well, why? So I think it can become very complex and very risky there if you don't have that drillable portion of it as well. So yeah, I think those are a couple things that can definitely get things into kind of a dashboard graveyard state. Mm-hmm. Another thing is model deployment. I think this was something I definitely struggled with like the first few models I like created. You'd create something and then no one would know what to do with it. It's like, oh, I did all this research, now what? And so having some sort of clear process that, especially people who are just starting out can follow. I think it's the biggest thing about things like MLOps, DevOps, things like that, is it helps people who, it doesn't just help people who are experienced in terms of, make sure you create maintainable systems, but I think it gives a clear set of directions for people who maybe are just starting in the industry. Because I don't think DevOps or model deployment is something that was often discussed, in your whatever school or coding boot camp that you might have taken. Maybe coding boot camps do, I don't know, but I don't think that's generally discussed. How do you actually take something from this idea, this research, this concept, and then deploy it? And I think that was a big miss. And so you'll have all these data scientists and ML people working, but if you don't actually know where to put it, how to implement it, I think you can run into issues. And then lack of business alignment. I think this kind of, I talked a little bit about this dashboard, but I do still think this is a problem that we suffer with, which it might be a dashboard, it might be an ML model. Oftentimes people might want to build something that doesn't really align with business goals. It might just be purely for the fact that they thought an idea was cool. Wouldn't it be cool if we had some sort of predictive, I don't even know, predictive way of knowing how many people will actually show up to work tomorrow? I don't know. That might be helpful. But the point being, it's like, sometimes there are things where it's like, if you have like concrete business goals already, you want to see if you've got good ideas for like models, data science, products, or dashboards that fit within that realm, rather than trying to completely disjoint your business's resources, just because often, again, you only have so many business resources. So if you build a model but you can't even act on the output of that model, it's not going to be very valuable to you. So you want to make sure that if you have a model that you're developing or a dashboard that you're developing, that there are steps that you planned out that you're going to basically do later. Like, okay, are you going to need to hire someone? When you're doing healthcare, like fraud detection, you need to then generally have an adjudicator look at those claims, and then they make that decision if that claim was fraudulent or not often. So you need to make sure that you have that plan in place. Also, because just going back to the healthcare example of fraud detection, sometimes, that fraud might have occurred on a service that was maybe, $100. Is it worth to hire someone to adjudicate that claim or not? And that runs into a whole other problem. So do you need to adjudicate it, or do you need to change your policies in your insurance plan to make sure you try to avoid that kind of fraud? So I think that's kind of why it's important to have that business alignment, because if you don't have a plan after you've developed this thing, it's going to be it's almost pointless that you built the thing in the first place. So that's kind of, I think, why you see a lot of issues, and why companies, there are companies that build dashboards for a living, and then there are some companies that build dashboards and models, and then they disappear internally. Of course, not the company, but the internal dashboard or model might disappear because it just never gets acted on. All right.
Alrighty.
All right. So kind of just what to consider, I think, from that, like what I like to consider, at least to try to avoid some of those problems when I'm building some sort of data product. Again,
sorry, Ben. We had one quick question. Sure. What do you mean by lack of business alignment in dashboards not aligning to business goals?
Yeah. So for example, and I should have just said dashboards or models, but basically, you know, it's very easy to build a dashboard that maybe provides some sort of information that, or KPI that maybe your business, like maybe okay, let me restart. Maybe your business for the next 3 months is trying to, you know, increase sales or something like that, or improve customer customer kind of like how they feel, customer kind of sentiment. But you know, your data analyst, instead of looking at ways to do that, is now spending time, you know, trying to build an ML model that can, I don't know, detect which person shows up to work that day by their face or something like that. You know, just something like that sounds really cool, but it's like, but it doesn't provide that business value. Or they're building a dashboard that reports on, you know, I'm trying to think of examples here, but basically you got a dashboard, you're reporting on a dashboard that has nothing to do with the actual stuff that your company is trying to do. Because at the end of the day, you have only so many resources, right? You only have so many, I shouldn't say resources, people. You only have so many people. And if you're building a dashboard that doesn't align with the things that your business is currently trying to do, again, whether it's increase sales, it's trying to grow, it's trying to, you know, maybe it's trying to consolidate its business, any of those things, if it's not aligning with those concepts that you've already decided and it's doing something else because, you know, they read a cool article about, you know, doing something with IoT devices, you know, it's going to waste a lot of time, because even if they were to successfully build that that model or dashboard, either one, it doesn't really do anything, or two, no one can act on it because all the other people are focused on these other business goals. So that's what I mean when I say lack of business alignment.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Okay. Too far. Okay. So basically, in order to try to avoid these are generally questions and things I try to ask both myself and you know, the clients that I work with. Basically, again, starting out with business goals, because I think that's where you always will start. You know, what business processes are we trying to drive? You know, again, are you trying to increase sales, decrease costs? Are you trying to improve customer satisfaction? I mean, at the top of it all, I always like to tell people, it's like at the end of the day, regardless of what you're doing, you're trying to increase sales or increase profit or decrease costs. But, you know, how you go about that is different, right? You might try to improve customer satisfaction. You might try to, you know, reduce waste. But all these things generally funnel to the same two top level goals. So yeah, just trying to define that, because that will help you kind of define what products you need to build. And then also, is this something that you want executives to take action on, or you just take action on, or is this just something that will be kind of underlying, you know? Because, you know, do you want, you know, for Netflix, do you want someone to click to watch more videos? You know, is that your goal? Do you want someone to keep scrolling through your feed? You know, what's the goal? Do you want an executive to, you know, increase resources to a certain problem? Like, what are you trying to do with this model or dashboard? So that's generally the first thing. From there, it's more data management. So I try to figure out, you know, like, what data do we have? Where does it exist? If they've already got kind of a process, you know, are you doing a lot of things in Excel documents? I've come through a lot of cases where it's like, oh, we've got like 3 or 4 different data sources. One of them is a database. One of them is this one team that produces this Excel file every 3 months, and we get it from them, and we, you know, kind of manually ingest it, and all these different processes. So trying to get an understanding as far as that goes. So that kind of leads to the next part, which is, okay, can we get a centralized process for extraction as well as access? You know, you don't want to have it all in various, you know, CSV, Excel, a database here, a database there. How do we kind of centralize this and extract it and create a clear process? And then what's our plan to QA? I think that's another thing that doesn't always get hit on, but, you know, every step along that process as far as extraction and data transformation goes, often doing some sort of QA is an important part in your data product lifecycle. I really like to think about that through every step. You know, the more logic, the more QA you add, or the more transformations you do, you just increase the risk of making data act in a way that you weren't expecting. Version control. How do you actually plan to manage the code, the data, and the business logic? You know, I think especially if you're doing like ML models, the concept of like versioning your data, that was something that I had only recently run into, and it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense as well. So there's all these different layers where you're having to, especially if you're doing like production in a large corporation, you have to consider, right? Like, you don't want to just consider, the code, which I think is a little more traditional from software, but you also have the data, and I also like to say the business logic, because those two components, whether that business logic is a model or some sort of just if-then logic, that can often change, right? Especially with I think business logic, 1 week, the rules might be one thing, the next week those rules might change, and making sure you can track that and understand why things are changing, I think is important. Logic QA, I think that's something that's definitely has a lot of risk. So, do you plan to ensure your SQL queries and business logic are accurate? What is it? What's the strategy moving forward? I think that's always an interesting place that gets missed. When I first started writing SQL queries, no one actually looked at my queries. I just wrote them, and then people trusted me, which is noble of them. But it's very easy, I think, to make very silly mistakes in SQL. You left join somewhere that you didn't mean to. You write a case statement incorrectly. You forget to check for divide by zero errors, whatever it might be. There's just a lot of risk. And I like to say, if you ask two different SQL engineers or SQL developers to write some query, you'll get two different results. Because you need to have the kind of next step underneath this is you need to have some clear definitions for concepts. The example I give here is I once worked with a company where we were trying to define the concept of multi-day trips. And one person basically said a multi-day trip was as if a trip existed on more than 2 days. So, on the first and the second, that was a multi-day trip. And another person defined it as if a trip lasted more than 24 hours. So there's slightly different definitions. So as you're writing SQL, you're obviously going to get different outputs. And so making sure you've kind of got clear definitions and that you are checking that, I think is also an important a level of work, especially especially in any industry really, because I think everyone makes assumptions about definitions, but having them clearly written out, I think is important. Next, do we test, and how are you planning to test kind of your data at various stages? And are you planning to do some sort of integration testing, being again from raw data to production, from production to your dashboard or your model? Are you actually checking to make sure that data is coming out the same way? If you were to write a query, in SQL on top of that data layer and do a similar kind of query on Tableau, would you end up getting the same output? So I think that's another aspect as far as when you consider what to consider when you're building data products. And then performance monitoring. This is more for ML work. So, how do you basically expect that model to perform? What are you expecting it to do? Are you expecting it to increase sales, increase clicks? Are you tracking that? I think that's a very important step that can easily get missed because we don't want to say an ML model did bad or good. But if your goal is to have an ML model increase clicks and you're not tracking it, how are you supposed to know if it's actually increasing clicks? And then also tracking more on the input and output side. Is the data changing? Has there been some massive change? I think you saw some problems. Just that I'm thinking about this, Nick. We saw tons of problems as far as how people were pricing electricity in Texas, and now there's some crazy bills that need to get paid, which obviously some of it that's maybe it's not model driven, however it's driven, but the point being is that kind of thing can happen where something so drastic can change that now your model acts very erratically and gives output that is undesirable. And so that's another kind of area that I think I like to remind people to think about. All right, so from here, kind of the data product lifecycle in theory. I'm going to say in theory because I'm going to kind of after this talk about some of the problems that we still kind of face, I think, even today. So in theory, I think the center is, again, some sort of business question or goal, right? We've got some sort of business question or goal, and I pluralize goals and not questions, but anyways. So basically the whole thing here is just trying to understand what's the business trying to do, what do they want to drive, what do they want to change, right? From there, things like data gathering, data management, data QA, data analysis, kind of that next step. Let's actually get everything together. Let's try to make sure that's coherent. From there, again, it's modeling and logic. I'm kind of using this so that you can kind of either do something like dashboards or more ML, but you're adding some sort of layer where you're basically doing some sort of either SQL or maybe you're implementing some sort of ML model that requires, again, some testing, ensuring that your model actually acts the way it should, making sure your errors are correct, whatever you're trying to do, or if your SQL queries, make sure you're double checking your SQL logic. Kind of testing leads into kind of model testing and logic. beyond just kind of the general QA, you've also got this next level of making sure that if you're to write some unit tests, that they still act the same way. Similarly, I think data testing, making sure that the data, as you're processing it, is still coming in the way that is expected. From there, you've got things like deployment, which is managing version control, build artifacts and deploying to production, and then monitoring. So kind of as I discussed. I think I saw a question come up. What were the questions?
Yeah, we've got a couple. We've got one right here. So is there something like metrics to measure that the data we have is to be considered of good
Quality when training your model? Because I know you mentioned quality in the very beginning, just in the same way we're talking about oil. Like you can do a lot of stuff with it, but depending on the quality.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways you can do that. I don't know if you can like quantifiably say it. Like maybe you could, but I think the big things are generally you can write kind of more QA tests. Like in general, maybe for like QA tests, in order to ensure that your data is good, you kind of need to add in your human element, right? Like because there are some things you can maybe test, like ranges. So like numeric ranges, I think are one way. And that can be done a little more automatically from like an anomaly detection area. But in general, I think most QA tests are a little more manual. Like maybe you're trying to detect if there are any issues with the categorical data set, like you're only expecting certain categories. And for some reason, there's someone fat fingered a category on the application side, like states. They misspelled a state, and now you've got misspelled states. Or maybe someone put in a date field where it should have been a numeric field. Or maybe someone put a number beyond 100% when it should have been percents. Again, maybe from a cost perspective, you're only used to seeing from accounting only like up to like $10,000, $100,000 charges, and suddenly you're seeing $1 million charge. So I think a lot of that comes down to you kind of running some sort of quick. I usually either create, or there are some tools that you can run some QA scripts that you can just run over your data just to ensure that this data is as good as it can be. I think there's always risk for some problems, but I think you want to get rid of those kind of big obvious errors as fast as possible. I don't know if that answered the question.
Anyway, keep going.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So from there, and then monitoring performance. And so this is kind of like, I like to say, like in theory, right? Like this is kind of the ideal kind of world, right? Like if everything was to flow smoothly, this whole process would go and you wouldn't have any issues. I think the problems and kind of reality is, oftentimes, business goals and questions section, we often focus more on hype versus impact. And I think that goes on both sides. I think from the tech side, we read an article and we're like, oh, this is such a cool idea. I want to put this, I want to implement this, NLP model or something that has nothing to do with the rest of the business, but I just want to do it because it's cool. Or again, similarly, a business side executive might have read an article, might have seen a competitor utilize some sort of thing that your team doesn't currently use. And, then suddenly they want to drive that into the goal, even though it has nothing to do with the rest of maybe that your company's goals for that moment. Also, just like a lack of communication. So as you're developing that product or that dashboard or that ML model, there's that lack of communication where you're not checking in to make sure, hey, what I'm building, does it actually match your expectations? Is it actually going to answer the questions that you want? Are we going to need to do future work to make sure that we can add more drillable features or whatever it might be? So I think that's definitely one of the problems. Data, I think the big things we often see here is patchwork data flows, meaning, again, there are so many different ways you can move data from point A to point B that people start using it. People might use macros for one team. They might use, again, SSIS, Airflow, all these various components. And even where maybe that data lives, one team might actually use the data warehouse. One team might just be trying to build their own side data warehouse. And there's just all of these various patchwork systems that you can develop that really make it hard to do the next thing, which is have clear data ownership. So, not knowing who actually owns data, not knowing where it's going, not knowing where to go to when maybe there's a problem, adds a problem, lack of data QA. I think maybe some teams put data QA in, some other teams, maybe they just assume, again, that all the data they're getting from the systems are accurate, not checking for duplicate data, not checking for inaccurate data. I always just assume data is wrong, or at least not clean. So, having some sort of QA layer is good to check to make sure that all the data you're getting is expected. And lack of data QA is kind of also tied to lack of data governance. So just making sure that, you have clear definitions, you have clear, you have clear sets of standards for what you define as accurate data and what you define as not just accurate, but also basically kind of that source of truth data, especially in modern systems that are so well integrated. You might have the same data field represented in multiple applications. You might have like employee kind of role or something, or sales numbers in multiple applications. And they're all kind of feeding off of each other and integrating on each other. And then as you're pulling that data, it's very easy to, maybe one team pulls from Salesforce, one team pulls from, I don't know, Zendesk or wherever else. And then you're doing similar reporting, but you were reporting slightly differently because they didn't integrate at the right time and you pulled the data at different times. And so that's often another issue as far as data flows go in that data lifecycle. Modeling logic, I think one big thing is like lack of peer reviews. Sometimes I think this is due to just a lack of ML engineers or data scientists. There's just not enough. So you sometimes lack peer reviews, especially again in SQL. I think having someone that goes over your code or goes over your logic, just to make sure, you're thinking the way that everyone else is thinking. It wasn't just in your head. I think that there's often that gap. Testing, kind of like lack of production level testing, I think can be a big gap, making sure that, the model you're developing or the dashboard you're developing is going to act the way you expect, not just in your test systems and, right, like the whole it ran on my computer concept, but making sure that you develop testing and unit tests and integration tests that will go beyond just your test data set, right? Like, okay, well, how is this model going to act in production once we start, providing it information? Deployments, I think there's still plenty of manual deployments, especially for models, and we're still, I think, working on that. And I'll be talking about a few products that are trying to work on this. But I think there's still a lot of manual deployment processes, just because it does take a lot to go from that to more CI/CD. Also, sometimes just overly complex CI/CD, where there's just too many steps involved to take a model from an idea to a final product. And then finally, just running it all in prod. I think that's probably more startups, but still a risk in its own. And then monitoring, so just there's no logging, no defined KPIs, and no traceability. So you can't even look at what data ran into that model when it did something wrong, or you don't even know what you're tracking because you never defined KPIs, et cetera. There's just lots of gaps there. Was there another question on this slide?
Yeah, one quick question. Basically, thinking whether this person mentioned, the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018 and how that might affect the alignment with business goals in order to build data products and do analysis, considering those new regulations here in Europe. People frequently talk about GDPR. But in this particular case, do you think that, the California Consumer Privacy Act could have, or basically what is the impact that it can have on the alignment of business goals?
Sure. I think it depends on the business itself, in the sense that like some businesses are very granular with their data, others aren't. Trying to think, I wish I knew all the stipulations for CCPA, because I know like 7 years with GDPR, but it's like, one, you can often have some data for a certain amount of time. I think with a lot of these policies, you can often hold that data for a certain amount of time, get rid of it, or they might, maybe a customer will ask to get removed and then you have to remove that data. It definitely adds implications. Having a data warehouse, I think, solves some of those problems because you have a lot of that data for your data product centralized. So if someone, asks for that data to be removed, you know where to remove it. So it fixes that problem. I think you'll run into problems, and I think, you see companies like Facebook and other advertisers complaining about this, even with like the things that Apple is doing. You are going to run into problems where, they're not going to be able to do as well of a service, giving you tailored ads, or, maybe you can't, what else could you maybe, there are other things though, like for example, that you don't always need people data. Like if you think about the Beyond pricing tool, you don't need people data. You just need to know the Airbnb and how much it went for, on certain days. So I think it just depends. Like obviously, if it involves people, you're going to have problems. You have to work around those. And I think there are plenty of people that are trying to work around those, either by anonymizing the data set so that, maybe you're not referencing a specific person, but you're referencing not too much information, because an interesting component about data is you only need a few. It's funny, I've done analysis like this. You only need like three random data points, like a person's birth year, their birth state, and like a few other things, and it's like you can kind of guess who they are. But yeah, they can anonymize data to a point where it's like not and get not to where you can kind of point back to that person and maybe hopefully still do analytics. I think companies are definitely trying to figure out ways around this. And I think there definitely are. Working in healthcare analytics, we often weren't necessarily reporting directly on a person, but we had to still kind of do a lot of analytics because, you didn't want to have direct names attached to things since it's healthcare. So, you often just have to spend time anonymizing things and thinking about, hey, are we gonna be able to trace back and how, and what's the process and what's the method if we have to. So yeah, I think there are methods already in place for other industries. So I think the current industries that have had their way with data for the last 5 or 10 years will just have to follow suit.
Okay.
All right. So from here, how can we improve the process? Why is it important to us? First, I just want to look at kind of what are the places we kind of need to fix. And I kind of brought this up: data management, data QA, testing and peer reviews, deployment and monitoring. So those are, I think, the big areas we're trying to fix. I think as far as trying to fix them, I think there are a lot of companies that try to do this manually. I think there are some things you can do manually, like testing and peer reviews. That's, you can maybe add in a manual process, doing something through Git, where you treat SQL just like you treat code. That's something I think I would definitely recommend, at least at the lowest level. It's like, that's something very easy to do. And you can just create some sort of analytics Git repository for your analytics team. It makes it much clearer, makes it easy to track. If someone, leaves your team, that's very easy. Data management, I think we've been doing that for a long time. It's just more about actually implementing it and executing on it. So I think I definitely see a lot of companies of all sizes trying to still do this because it's a challenge. Data QA, I think that's harder because so many people use data. So the question becomes, who has to QA, when, where. I think it's definitely still a challenge. And then deployment and monitoring, I think we're still are kind of what we're currently fixing. I think that the top 3 are a little more fixable. I think deployment and monitoring is where we're trying to do a lot of fixing. And I think like tools that help kind of improve your data product and your data flow in general, I think there's a lot of them that are coming out there. If you're talking about data ops, so things that try to like track everything from like how your data changes over time and what's going on. You've got DoK, Delta Lake, and DVC, which all try to help version control or do something in terms of like managing data more than just storing it as a database, but actually storing it and kind of tracking changes over time. Similar, I'm going to use I don't know if the term analytics ops is used. I'm sure it probably is, but like you see it with like DBT, DVC, PopSQL sort of, just because you're adding some aspects of version control to your transformation and your transformations and logic. So I think those are definitely some tools that are definitely trying to simplify that whole flow, so that it's not just you pull in that data and then you're actually tracking how that data is being changed. And so I think that's another kind of beneficial area. Similarly, like from analytics side, there's also MLOps, which is trying to really improve the whole deployment process. Again, for me, when I first developed my first model, I had no idea what to do with it. Just like, what do I do? So I think there's a lot of companies like MLflow, Kubeflow, SageMaker that are all trying to make that a little clearer. Kubeflow tries to do a lot and adds a lot of tools as far as adding a layer onto Kubernetes and giving you a ton of different kind of operators and tools to really process and deploy a model. And so I think that's like a whole aspect I'm looking forward to seeing. Y Labs is, I think, interesting as far as like startups go. They definitely are really focusing on trying to create more traceability into your models. So this is kind of more after deploying and tracking things and making sure that, everything that your model is doing is what you expect it to do, and making it very easy to kind of find what's going on and what's wrong. Data QA. So this is kind of, someone asked earlier about like, can you check your data? Are there, how would you kind of quantify that? There are tools that are trying to basically automate this process. So like First Egan or Write Data, where they're basically trying to create this ability to look at data sets and create more, create more automated processes as far as like data QA goes. And then finally, I think a big area is collaboration. So there's a ton of collaborative tools, again, range from PopSQL to Domino Data Lab to Saturn Cloud. PopSQL, if you don't know, or Popsicle, I think people say it both ways. Basically, it's trying to make SQL similar to, like, you can think like Google Excel sheets or Figma, where anyone can kind of comment and collaborate on SQL queries. which, and as well as version control. So that adds the benefit of, maybe if you're a product manager or something like that, you can kind of come in and look at a data engineer or analyst logic and make sure, it makes sense even with you. Similarly, like Saturn Cloud makes it very easy to collaborate on Jupyter Notebooks, as does Domino Data Lab. Both of them basically offer various features in terms of tracking kind of what changes you make. So they do version control as well as making it very easy to comment. I think Domino Data Lab is definitely the bigger product, so it's like more mature. They have tons of features as far as like collaboration and comments, and they even go to the point of, I think, allowing you to basically deploy models and track those models as well. But yeah, so this is kind of, I think, the main array of tool sets that you'll probably see. I think I saw a question.
Yeah, regarding MLOps tools, do you have a chart or slide to show the comparison between these tools? I think that'll be for another meetup.
I was like, I think it's already like, it's just gonna get.
It's all good. It's all good. The question's very much welcome. I think we can continue the conversation, Slack, Twitter, etc. But anyway.
Yes, I think that would be the case. I think the quick note that I saw, like the biggest thing I think that's been, at least last when I used it, was that I think MLflow is a little bit more mature, but I think overall they do a lot of similar stuff. So it's like it's one of those things that I think it's good to play with. But I don't have a slide comparing, sadly. I think I'll be wrapping up here shortly. But what does this all kind of solve? Again, all the tools really, their goals are to solve things like version control, QA and peer reviews, testing, feature stores, which is something more along your ML models, actually storing kind of features and tracking what features are used in various models, model and data registries, and ML model performance. So I think this is where we solve a lot of problems. Oh, I just realized I didn't fix the numbers for this. I was supposed to. Well, okay. So the last two slides. So what are the benefits of all this? One, we have more maintainable systems. I think that's the biggest goal for me. Well, one of the biggest goals, and as well as reliable outputs. So maintainable systems are big, again, because I think I was scarred by my first job, where I left that job and just realized everything I built was going to go away because I was the only person maintaining it. So maintainable systems, I think that's important. Reliable outputs, I think trustworthiness is hugely important in the data field. If you can't trust your data, if you create dashboards that people can't rely on, people are going to quickly just stop using data and just continue going with their guts on decisions. So I think it's very important that we make sure we have reliable outputs. Better business alignment, again, just making sure that things we're doing actually align with what the business is trying to doing, not just the things that we think are cool. So then that way you actually get the benefits of data, and the actions that your team is making and the actions that the business is taking, driven by that data, is actually doable and isn't kind of stuck because there's no one there to actually take action on that data. And then finally, simpler onboarding for devs. I think this is hugely important because if you're a new dev and there's no clear deployment system, where it's very complex, right? Like you've got like a 30-page document on how to deploy your ML model or deploy code, it becomes very, very quickly hard for them to do their work, and also just makes it very, you almost hold back on deploying code when it's that complex. But when you make code very easy, or ML models very easy to deploy, it's much more likely, I feel like, that you're going to deploy code. So I think that's also a benefit. Just some general challenges you'll face. Cultural buy-in. I think that's always a challenge you'll face because, if people have been doing things manually for years, it's very hard to let go.
The resistance. Yeah, we see it with
it's
everything.
Always there, right? Like it's very hard to go to automated things because, it's letting go of control. And if you've been doing that forever, it's hard to do. Sometimes I even see it where it's like, oh yeah, I should let go of this. But also I just want to check to make sure it's doing the things I want. Balancing process and action. I think this is always a challenge because I think, you want to add in process, you want to add in this kind of MLOps or whatever you want to call it to your whole process, but you don't want it to kill innovation. You don't want it to now take 6 months to deploy code. You still want to make it very simple and very quick. And then finally, I think finding the right tools. There's so many tools out there. Again, I showed I think 3 of each just because I didn't want to go in depth, but go Google MLOps tools and you'll find VC and other people's MLOps market maps with tools that are only 20 pixels each because they have so many. So finding the right tools I think is hard, but I think the big thing is keep it simple. Just try to solve a few problems at first, Don't go for every tool that you need. Start with one problem, like how to deploy your model or how to manage your data or whatever it might be first, and then make sure that's integrated, and then get your next tool. So that's what I'd say challenges are. Some of the ways I've kind of seen people and some of the clients I've improved kind of their data life cycles. One, upgraded from cron. I think it's been a huge change for the clients that I've done that for. Now they don't have to risk or have the issues that you run into when you're managing data flows with cron, which is often dependency management is tricky if it happens at all. So I've had companies kind of move away from that. Created the integration tests for their dashboard so they can actually rely on it, and they are not having to manually have people kind of go through dashboards anymore. I think that's been a big thing, moving away from kind of some more manual, you can call it testing, but really just clicking through to make sure the output is correct. And then implemented KPI tracking for their models. So actually making sure that when I've been building models for them or they've had models built in the past, that we actually follow that up with actually building some sort of KPI tracking. In this case, it was a lot to do with like optimization or pricing and figuring out, okay, is this optimization or pricing actually working or not? And so like helping them implement that system so that they can look at that number and not just trust that the model is working. So I think that is the key areas I've seen this just benefit people. And with that, takeaways. I have so many slides. So just some key takeaways. Basically, developing a product, I think, takes a lot more than writing a SQL query or making a model. I think there's a lot that has to go with in terms of thinking through the process. There are a lot of places I think that data can go wrong, and so making sure that you have processes in place that can track that and fix it are important. And just having general processes, I think, improve kind of efficiencies and maintainability. And that's really, again, kind of I think my main goals. So thanks so much for listening. And I think now what? Now we have Q&As.
No, I think we're all good, man. We got through a lot of questions as well. To begin with, one thing, as we're finishing up though, I mean, if we can pin you down, and it's okay if you prefer not to get too deep in this, being somebody who works with data so much, like in our community, we talk a lot about all the different databases that are out there, and they're different ones based on different needs. Do you have, I know you mentioned a couple things earlier, but databases that you feel more comfortable working with, that you just feel or align better with your clients' needs?
As far as like what databases go, I think overall I've definitely had the opportunity to work with a lot of companies more that aren't needing huge databases. So I've honestly, like in some cases, got away with like doing something on Postgres rather than like Redshift or Snowflake, because the performance on that is just as optimal if you don't have big data, or it's like the performance benefits you can get from building on Snowflake or something like that.
That's the thing, is because we've had more than a couple of meetups with folks that are really big in the Postgres community, and they say this is just in the same way you're talking about Python, this is about as battle tested as you can get. It's like we know, functionally speaking, there aren't going to be any crazy surprises. Depending on the use case, depending on your client, what they're looking for, their other technology stack and things that they might be looking for. Yes, we do encounter. We had a meetup last week with someone from MariaDB. We've had CockroachDB on here. We touch a lot on this database topic. But I think once again, as with so many other things, it really comes down to use cases.
Yeah.
And so like you said, is that if you're dealing with customers that are or clients that are they're making it that they have a certain amount of customers, that they have a certain amount of people in their CRM that they're working with and that they're processing, a lot of it depends on what's going to be the best fit, and not force a particular situation just because we might find it more attractive or that has bells and whistles or certain features. In the same way that you were talking about tools, there are tons of tools out there, but if and when it makes sense for the use case, the business case that you have. All right, we won't take up any more of your time. I think we definitely have enough to move on to schedule another meetup with you. So I would definitely like to do that. For all the folks that want to check out Ben's blog, website, all you got to do is type in Seattle Data Guy. Very easy to find. We'll try to probably continue the conversation on Slack as well. So if you got questions, feel free to jump in there too. Before we finish, we have a tradition. You met Angel in the very beginning. Gorka, can you share my screen? So what Angel has been doing while you've been talking is creating an artistic rendition of all the different things that we're talking about. And we have a little bit of extra interesting details in this drawing because Angel's first language is Spanish. And in Spanish, from The Lion King, the song is The Cycle of Life. In English, it's A Circle of Life. So that's why we got that little Lion King tribute in there, but I think it ties in very, very nicely.
Awesome.
So anyway, it's always nice to have Anka with us because he creates a great representation of what's going on. Then we owe you a lot. We got a ton of info out of this. I think it's great groundwork for a lot of folks for whom this is very overwhelming about, where do I start? I think all the people you're working with as a consultant are very lucky to have you. Your hunger for knowledge and your willingness to share it is very clear through your blog. So like I said, I think we need to think about a future date. And I still want to talk about data and food. So that's a perfect excuse to continue the conversation. But anyway, we got plenty of questions. Like I said, we can continue the conversation in Slack. Thank you very much. And we'll have the video up for everybody else on Thursday. Right. So we'll get that up soon. Perfect. Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Cheers.
All right. See you. Bye.
Bye.